Hi everybody, today I thought I was going to do a video about suffering and sorrow and the music of suffering and sorrow. It's been on my mind to do for a while and I just left it and I thought, well, hey, let's just get on and do it. As individuals we can suffer. Collectively we can suffer. We also can feel sorrow for another. We can feel grief individually. We can feel grief collectively. Some of the music I'm going to show you here are some are songs, some are pieces of music, but all come from a place of suffering and sorrow. So let's just crack on with it. Now, if you've got any records and music that you could show, that would be fantastic. Now, there's a whole world of things you could argue. I mean, anyway, we'll get to it. Some of you might say that some music induces suffering and sorrow. You know who you are. But let's have a look at some of the first aspects, the first things. So initially I'm thinking, let's look at some people who suffer on a personal level. Now, things can happen in our lives. We may suffer from depression. We may have black dog, as Churchill called it, and we may express that sorrow and that suffering through our songs. And whether we do it, we're expressing the words and saying, this is how I feel, or whether we're just using pictures and examples. I mean, Nick Drake and his last few tracks from his BBC sessions were absolutely the essential suffering, the expression of suffering. I was going to say the quintessential, I don't think that's the right word. They really do express where he was at mentally and emotionally, and he was suffering internally, and those words and the harrowing quality of it was something he was going through, and of course he used to die young. Another situation, of course, for personal suffering is an accident. Something may happen to you and you have to grieve the loss of something you may not be able to deal with. For example, here we have Rock Bottom, of course, famously written when he was in hospital, although that's not strictly true. He conceived and wrote a lot of his stuff before he had his accident, where of course he fell out of the window and ended up paralysed from the waist down. Now, as a drummer, you might think he obviously had a lot to go through. He had a lot to work out. And I think it comes through in the quality of that music. If he'd have still been a drummer and hadn't had the accident, I dare say all of those songs would have had a very different quality, probably far more upbeat. He would have played the drums, there'd be a lot more kind of jazz shuffling and rhythms going on. And it would have probably been a lighter affair. But stripped back to just using a toy drum or a battery on a tray, which is what he was using at times, it really personalizes the sound. It brings it into focus, and it just makes it more of an exceptional listen. You don't need to know that guy suffered as he did to get something of that from the record, from the way he's expressing his love for his partner, and just the way, the slight sort of mad elements of it, and the kind of chaotic nature of where his mind might have been. And yet it's still very, very, it's very personal, but it comes from a place of suffering, although it initially did. And of course, another expression of personal suffering, and an all-time classic example of it, is drug abuse. And there are many, many drug abusers, of course, in the music world, and have been. And some of them make it and some of them don't. But Hurt is probably a better example of a song about taking drugs and the effect and the suffering and the sorrow of having to go through that, and the addiction. Nothing comes close to that track, really, does it? I think especially as Johnny Cash, interpreted it, because again he made it very personal. Him and a guitar so close to the mic, and it's just, here it is. And it's no bells and whistles, no sort of frills and thrills. It was just, has a harrowing quality, which we can all instantly kind of connect with, because as a soul speaking to a soul, if you like. Now, a slightly different expression of suffering can come from a place, where you live. Now, some good old examples. Dust Bowl ballads here. There's a great picture of what it would be like to live in that dust bowl. And all of these songs by Woody Guthrie of Great Dust Storm, Talking Dust Bowl Blues, Dusty Old Dust, there's all sorts of Dust Bowl Refugee, Dust Can't Kill Me, Dust Pneumonia Blues. There's obviously you're expressing something about the place and the quality of that place and what it's like to suffer in that place and what it's like to be affected by your environment. Now, the one environment we usually hear in music, and what we're all aware of, and we kind of get it pummeled into our brains, it's this idea of the ghetto. Now, the classic track on here, of course, is The Ghetto. Donny Hathaway, Elvis did In the Ghetto. Those wonderful songs, but they encapsulate something about the poverty and about the incredible hardship of living somewhere like that. Now, some of it, I think, nowadays as a kind of idea of a ghetto, it's not actually, people aren't living in ghettos, but they might call that area a ghetto, and just it becomes a glamorized thing, a losing touch with what a ghetto actually is. They're not living in Rio de Janeiro, they're not living in the ghettos in South Africa. They're using a term and a phrase and kind of glamorizing it. But expressions of songs like The Ghetto that wasn't glamorizing it. Now, you could argue that a certain aspect of glamorization of the ghetto, I'm going too far. This is still an element of suffering. I think people who express this, the old hip-hop groups and artists, before they became millionaires and left the ghetto behind them, and just took the sensibility and the lifestyle with them. They understood what it was like to have that suffering, to have your friends shot and killed, to be in drug gangs, to have that sense of place. Otherwise, they'd always be, generally, you'd see a sort of arguing against the system or against something else. But the reality of their lives are expressed in lyrics, and you hear them, and you don't hear so much that it's suffering, but it comes from a place of suffering. It comes from a place of, very complex world, and a destructive and harmful and devastating world, which of course, you could glamorize and keep within, or you can try and escape. Now, another great example, and I don't want to go into too much in these because these are obvious examples. We were talking about collectively experiencing things. That's something we've had there as a collective experience, and it's the same with songs like Strange Fruit, of course. The expression of a social and political injustice going on around you, not necessarily said in so many words, but expressed so powerfully in the meaning of that. Now, there's huge numbers of those sorts of expressions of that kind of political stuff. I'm not going to get involved in all of that. Another example of collective suffering is the Jews in World War II, of course. I showed this record before. This is 6 million in heaven, 3 million in hell. A Jewish soundtrack to this particular film. And of course, we all know that they had suffering, they went through so much, and we still hear about it, and we still know that it existed, and we won't ever forget it. But people expressed that. I mean, you go right back, even you might hear the song Boney M, by the rivers of Babylon. That was from a psalm, and that psalm was the people of Israel being taken into captive. And we sat and wept, they said in that. You hear that song by the rivers of Babylon, where we said, the lyrics are really heavy. They're talking about a moving of a whole people into another place, into a place of suffering, into a place where they're remembering, they're harking back to the world that they lost. And this huge tragedy is expressed not only afterwards, and the sorrow of what they went through and the grief of it, but also the grief and the sorrow of being in it. There are famous writings and whatnot from the time, and people who died in the camps, etc. This is a really good example of music of expressing suffering and sorrow. 3 different movements. This is Goretzky, of course. This most famous work, Symphony No. 3. This is probably the classic version of Dawn Upshaw. The second movement is the words are actually from a Gestapo, written on the Gestapo cell. Someone who was a prisoner in a Gestapo cell. Horrible, Another one is three movements, and each movement, these are words taken from different places. I made a note of one. One is a Polish lament about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and one is a Silesian folk tune of some words from a woman who lost looking for her dead son through the Silesian uprising. So these are pieces of music which are very powerful, which transcend something, transcend suffering in a way, because when people suffer, they need to express it. We all know there are stages of grief, there are stages of suffering, and time can heal, but it doesn't mean we have to forget. And also in those sorts of pieces of music, there's the catharsis of playing that music. There's sometimes, of course, people haven't gone through it, but they're touched. A composer may be touched by something, may be moved by something, maybe reading something, hearing about other people's experiences, and want to express something themselves about it, whether they've been through it or not. I showed this not that long ago. This is Berg and his violin concerto. The last piece he wrote, it was written for the death of a young lady, a friend's daughter who died, and he was moved to write this, and it's an incredibly powerful piece of music, and the stages he's written it in as the stages of her life, so you get these sort of happy moments and sad, and then in the end it's in the grief, and these stages of her life are really well expressed in the piece of music. I recommend, if you haven't seen that before, checking that out. But of course, like we said, that's a personal grief. That's a very personal expression of expressing their feelings for someone who has gone. Another expression of grief, of course, just being able to get this, can be expressed in a religious manner. Here we have Mozart's Requiem. And there are many requiem masses written by the classical composers, of course, which deal with the idea of mortality and immortality and death and grief and everything else. It's just, it's on a huge scale. So it's not just people, if you like, a group of people. We're talking about like potentially a world view, like all people. Now another aspect, and I'm going to end on this, is of course a personal aspect of expressing suffering, and it can just be the suffering of a relationship, of going through difficulty. You find that a lot in women's lyrics. I think that's, that's a given in some respects. Lucinda Williams here, this fantastic track, what's it called? Change the Locks, it's brilliant. I've had enough of you, man. I'm changing the locks. You're not going to find me anymore. You're not going to come into my world. I've had enough and I'm moving on. But there's a real sense of pain, the intense emotional, personal pain in some of these fantastic lyrics, just to deal with relationships. I mean, there are so many aspects, in a sense, of suffering and sorrow. I've just shown you a few bits. If you could show me some, if you wanted to follow on with this, that'd be great. I've kind of rambled, and if you got this far, well done indeed. Have I really said anything? All I'm going to say, to sort of sum up, is we can see the importance and the power of music and expression in song form, in musical form, to deal with and to encapsulate suffering and to express it so other people understand it, but also as a cathartic thing on an individual and even on a collective scale. I think it's possible with music, when someone's expressing something, or a group of people expressing something in a collective way, it's possible for a group of people to experience that and to collectively change or move on, or have their senses and their own kind of emotions collectively changed. And I think it can happen. It's obvious when we're talking about the social and political things, people can adopt an attitude or adopt an opinion, or say, well, I believe this and I believe that, we're going to follow this and follow that. And that can change things and change the world. And I suppose, in a sense, the ability to express in music, the ability to express in song, and to receive what's being given, what's being recorded or what's being transmitted, is an incredible thing, and it can be a life-changing and world-changing thing. It really can be a world-changing thing, whether it's a personal level or even collectively. It can be a very, very transcendent and do I say mutative? No, I'm not going to. It's just a very moving thing. And anyway, that's enough of that, and I'll see you all later.